Welcome to the Executives Lounge. This is your podcast host, Christine Fauner. I am bringing you amazing stories from amazing women in leadership from across the globe. Let's get started. We have Alicia Lifrak today on the Executives Lounge podcast. She is coming to us from the greater St. Louis area. She's the Executive Vice President of the Pursuant Group, which is an organization that helps people find, engage, and give to the organizations whose purpose they are passionate about. Alicia is a strong advocate for philanthropy, entrepreneurial change, and is a champion for social justice. I would love for you, Alicia, to come into the show. Welcome, and tell us what exactly it means for an organization to dedicate itself to helping people give to other orgs.
Thank you, Christine. I'm super excited to be with you today and delighted to tell you a little bit about the Pursuant Group and what we do. We are a marketing agency. I mean, that would be the best way to describe it in, I would say, layman's terms, but we work exclusively with nonprofit organizations. So all the work we do helps charitable entities throughout the U.S. to help raise much needed funds to achieve their mission. We work in all subsectors of the nonprofit world. So we kind of cover the gamut, and we provide marketing, fundraising, and technology solutions to help the organizations achieve what they need to do in their revenue goals.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. Well, and I remember when we first chatted that you talked about having a really gypsy nomadic soul. And so tell me how that fits in to the work you do and who you are.
Sure. So I started moving around very early in life. My mom was from Iowa. My dad was from New York City. So we went back and forth between those places. We were in Southern California. We back to Iowa. So just kind of hopscotching around, had family all over the US. So traveled a lot. So just sort of, it got built into my DNA, if you will, that to be on the road. And then once I entered my professional career, I started working with a nonprofit organization, and one of the sort of HR components of that organization was that you had to physically move, like geographically relocate every 2 to 3 years was the norm. And so I did. And when I started, I was single and I was able to kind of move. So I worked in a couple spots in the Midwest, and then I moved out, was in upstate New York for a while, then went to Seattle, then back to the Midwest, to the St. Louis area. It just felt very normal to be on the go, if you will. But then life happened, and I have several children now.
How many is several? Is that a gaggle?
I have a 15-year-old son who's will be going into high school as a sophomore this coming year. And then I have triplets who just turned 11, so 2 girls and a boy, and they're going into middle school this year. So once with one we could move. When one went to 4, the idea of packing everything up and moving every 2 to 3 years seemed less reasonable. So I left that nonprofit organization. I haven't moved geographically, but my clients are all over the US. So I still get that nomadic bug fixed.
Right. Can you explain to me, I'm not a marketing person. In fact, it's something that I really shy away from. I try to hire other people to do that. Tell me how a marketing firm is critical to helping people who have money and want to give it away get to the right people who need money because they have this wonderful organization mission that they're trying to fulfill.
Sure. What we kind of bring to the table for the organizations we work with, we have kind of a couple of realms of things that are beyond the do-it-yourself mechanism. So from the standpoint of just basic strategy, we know what works. We work with hundreds of organizations, so we have an understanding of how the donor thinks, what's important to them, how do we communicate that message, we can do pretty robust analytics on an organization's database, so we can get a sense for who is currently supporting them, who used to support them, who should we be talking to more, what should we be sending to them, and do they want to hear from you in the mail? Do they want to hear from you via email? Like, what channel do they want to be communicated with? So we can help an organization be really smart with that investment, because nonprofit organizations in particular have really finite resources. They don't have gigantic budgets. We want to help them get the biggest return on every dollar they spend. So a lot of the work we do is helping them to figure out how to resource that. And then we do on the back end, after we kind of facilitate whatever those campaigns are, we'll do a lot of results and performance analysis to really hone in on what worked, what didn't work. We're testing messages. So it's, anybody can write a letter and take it to the Kinko's and make 100,000 copies and mail them out. But that isn't necessarily strategic. So what we try to do is just be thoughtful and hopefully helpful to those organizations to make sure that every dollar they spend is achieving some goal or some objective.
In leadership, we talk a lot about storytelling, and I like to use storytelling a lot in my coaching because, I used to say a lot when I had my own team, your story drives the narrative. And so if you want to drive your own narrative, you have to be really good at telling your story. And your continuous telling of that story is what creates the perception of who you are and what you're doing and how well you're doing it. And so I think, if the more we can learn, understand, and then be able to tell our story, the more compelling we are in owning our own narrative towards our end goal. So when I'm listening to you talk about this, that's what I'm hearing is, an organization has to be so good at telling their story to find the people that want to contribute and be part of that story.
It's funny because storytelling, like literally, if you go to our website, that is like front and center. We are a storytelling organization, and that is we build all of our fundraising, marketing campaigns, everything. Even when it comes to data, which is a very numbers-driven exercise, our approach to data is even your data will tell you a story. Like we need to get to the heart of what is happening here, what's going on. And so, yes, we pride ourselves on being storytellers on behalf of hundreds of great causes, and helping those organizations to do what they need to do within their communities to serve the people that they are seeking to help solve the problems of the world. And it's particularly interesting because it's gigantic. People don't realize how big it is. It's actually, I want to say it's like 10 or 12% of the workforce works in a nonprofit organization. It's the third largest employment sector in the private sector. So it's huge. And yet, I think most people, when they think of nonprofit, they don't think of this gigantic thing. They don't realize how impacted they are. They don't recognize like how many nonprofit organizations they interact with on a day-to-day basis. So I think one of the challenges that the nonprofit sector has is the need for more storytelling, the need to build on that brand awareness, if you will, connecting the dots for the consumers, but essentially the general public, I don't think realizes all the work that's being done in their communities by nonprofits. They just sort of assume that stuff gets done and they don't recognize the source of where that comes from. And then how important those donors are to making that possible, because the lion's share of nonprofits, 70%, 65% of funding comes directly from individuals. So it's a really huge piece of every successful community is the nonprofit sector. And yet most people don't know. They don't know it's that big. They don't know it's that big of a deal. I think it's 10% of the workforce, but it's the third largest.
Oh, sorry, third largest.
Yeah, it's huge. And so this is a really interesting data point correlation that I just read yesterday. So like 10% of the workforce works directly in a nonprofit organization, so 1 in 10, if you will, of all the general public of working population. There was a recent survey that was done, and only 5% of Americans stated that they had any interaction with nonprofit organizations. So hilariously, like
those numbers don't add up.
They don't add up. Exactly. So somehow there are people working for a nonprofit organization that don't realize they're being impacted by nonprofits. 1.9% of the national GDP is what all the nonprofits live off of. And there's 1.5 million nonprofit organizations, and they're somehow like hobbling it together from the table scraps.
Yeah, I've talked to a few executive directors in the last month for this podcast, where we talk about fundraising and we talk about the frustrations of jumping through the hoops and feeling like you're groveling, feeling like you're begging, and then feeling like you have to give gratitude and thanks to a high degree when you do receive money. And we were just talking about kind of the toxicity of some of that, right? Like there's some really wonderful, fun, like foundations. There's some wonderful donors that really believe and trust in these orgs, but there's kind of a beat up culture around fundraising, I think, in our nonprofit world.
I think there's a misnomer. I think there's an idea out there that nonprofits don't make any money or don't and so there's this idea that they're not smart business people, and yet they're probably some of the folks who are running nonprofit organizations are the savviest business people you'll ever meet, because they have to do so much more with so much less, and every single thing they do has a magnifying glass. And transparency is good, and we want these organizations to be open with kind of how they're using those donors' dollars, but they can't, there's no risk potential for them. They're not allowed to make mistakes. They can't spend huge amounts of money on marketing. They can't even really pay their people. You can have super talented folks, but there's going to be donors who raise their eyebrows if they're like, well, how much are you paying them? And yet nobody questions that in other sectors. Nobody's wondering how much the R&D team at Coca-Cola is making. Doesn't even occur to anybody to be worried about it. So if you found out that the guy who's making new Coke made $500,000 last year, you'd be like, oh, well, good for him. But if you find out the guy who's running the food bank and feeding hundreds of thousands of people a year, he makes $500,000 a year, absolutely not acceptable. So the double standard is crazy, that somehow by doing good, there's this skepticism that like, well, you can't earn a living doing that. Like you have to take a vow of poverty just to help. So it's a tough spot for these amazing, wonderful people. But not surprisingly, there's a high burnout factor. So a lot of folks get frustrated. They become exhausted, and they kind of like switch gears and move to the private sector. And it's an unfortunate loss.
Lately, there's been this sense of buyer's fatigue. I don't know if you've experienced this or you've seen it, especially on social media or any kind of ad space. We're tired of being sold to, right? Like, and everybody's hungry for buyers. Have
Yeah.
you seen that in your work? And do you see that in terms of any trends that are happening with you guys?
So we've had, yes, a lot of that. And in the nonprofit sector, I would say it's slightly different. But we've seen sort of a steady increase for 20 plus years of dollars donated until 2022 was the first year that number dipped. And so it's kind of a big thing going on. Literally this week, that data was just released. The number that's been declining over those 20 years, though, steadily has been the number of donors. So what we've been seeing over 20 years is fewer and fewer people giving, but giving larger. Those who are giving larger gifts. And so it kind of like we finally hit that breaking point where it toppled. So fewer donors in 2022, fewer people gave and gave less money. So I think so donor fatigue is a big deal. We certainly are aware of that. With those finite resources and with, only X amount of dollars to do whatever, they've made some probably short-term business calls and versus long-term growth investments. And so focusing on a smaller and smaller pool of your major donors, dedicating all of your organization's fundraising resources to this, it's the old adage of, fewer eggs in the basket. They've put all of this importance and focus on a smaller subset versus really catering to and creating opportunities for those $25 annual donors or 50, the kind of those one-off gifts. You get a bigger bang for your buck to get the $1,000 donor than
the 25.
20.
Right.
I understand it, but the problem is that consumer fatigue goes across everything. There's information overload. There's so much coming at people that I think unless you, as an organization, as a nonprofit organization, have really built a relationship with those donors to make them feel like they're a part of something bigger and a part of something important, and build that relationship that directly translates to the impact they're making. If you don't do that, then it's just another transaction. So finding that sweet spot in how to communicate and how to build as a nonprofit organization, how do you build your brand and become essential to your donors to make sure that even when budgets get lean and even when there's information overload, like they're going to stick with you. It'll be a challenge for a lot of organizations in 2023 and beyond to figure out how do we do this differently. And to your point, the fatigue is it's very easy to tune out. It's very easy to mass delete 100 emails from your inbox and not even open them, not even look at them. So how do you break through the noise?
I kind of want to transition on that last thought into leadership, actually. As executive vice president of the Pursuant Group, you have this leadership opportunity to kind of drive your own organization in how to handle some of these data points and knowledge bases and challenges. A leadership career trajectory. What have you learned about yourself in that space over time?
So leadership is my favorite subject and topic.
I know it was so exciting to get to know you over this.
I've been for my entire life like a student of leadership, but what I realized in studying leaders and folks and everything from on a national stage or a world stage to the guy who was my boss 20 years ago, thinking through how different people lead and how different styles can be very effective. There's no one size fits all when it comes to what makes a good leader, other than I think being authentic is a huge part of it. So understanding and building, for me, building my leadership style came a lot through my own growing up and maturing. I had leadership roles in high school. I was the editor-in-chief of my newspaper. I was in student government, whatever. In looking back, I wasn't necessarily a good leader. I had a boss title, but I had not grown and developed into a place where I understood what I now know all these years later. And I think, there's probably a couple of my key takeaways of things that I employ now and I feel like make me more successful are, being authentic. I think recognizing the difference between being a manager and being a leader. A manager,
that's a huge one. Yeah, talk about that for a minute.
Process and it's checkpointing and whatever, and it's yelling at you or whatever. A leader is somebody who inspires someone to want to do their best work. And then if you're really good, gets out of the way to let them soar. Figuring out how to do that successfully is a big part of my own kind of leadership journey. And then I think one of the key things I learned really, really early on, I had a great first boss, like right when I got out of college, and he was really a wonderful mentor and modeled a lot of the best behaviors that I now try to employ myself. But one of the biggest was recognizing the responsibility you have to take care of those around you. You have to take care of those that have been entrusted to you. And part of that is recognizing the importance of giving the credit away, shining that spotlight, like helping to rise others up into their own best version of themselves. And sometimes that means elevating them to a place that they no longer are on your team. They no longer work for your company. And that's okay. Like that's part of that sort of, I guess it's that philanthropic part of me that's like, no, I want to be a part of their journey to help them to get to be the best version of what that can be. Obviously, I always want the best talent to want to work with me and work for me, but sometimes they got to jump out of the nest. Like they got to go soar and fly on their own. Early on in my career as a staff leader, I was wearing the costume, if you will, of how I thought a boss should act and try to be more serious and whatever. And now I'm like, that's just silly. Like I goof around, I tell jokes. Like I don't feel like anybody should take themselves too seriously. And so to lead by example, I start there. Like I like to have fun at work, like to joke around. I feel like you get a lot further building that camaraderie.
I have a really similar story, starting in leadership. Started really, really early on. I became fascinated with behavioral science and relational intelligence. And so really early on in my career, I wanted to become a leadership expert, and look at me, here I am. But, you make a good point that when the reason I got really interested in that, the reason I became really passionate about being a leadership expert is when I first started, I wasn't good. I mean, I was good, but in my mind now, 20 years later, I wasn't good, right? You're just figuring stuff out. And I think when you're figuring stuff out, there's a level of insecurity and there's a little bit of confidence building that has to happen. There's some experience that has to happen, some learning, and I think over time, when you reflect back, you think, well, of course I cared. Of course I was a good leader, but now I know to be a good leader, I have to be me. And I think when we first start, we think, well, I have to be what everybody thinks a leader has to be for them. Right. And there's a control power thing because you're not really sure how to do it. As you realize what makes you really, really good, it's being able to come to work as your whole self.
Right. And I think one of the huge kind of core components of any good leader is self-awareness. And it's always shocking to me how many people I interact with at various levels of leadership and otherwise that don't have it. Like I never take for granted that people possess that, but it is hugely instrumental in not only your own professional and personal development, but as it relates to how you build up others. But like having the ability to own, like I say, I own a really good mirror. I know what I'm good at and I know what I'm not good at. And it's not that I'm not striving to be better, but I'm also okay with the fact that I'm not going to be great at every single thing. What I can be good at is building a team of folks around me to be good at I'm very comfortable hiring people who are different than me, who are good at things that I'm not good at, because I feel like that builds the team, that makes us more whole. And to your point, like being your full self is also kind of acknowledging your warts, if you will, like what I'm good at, what I'm not good at. It's okay. Like it's okay to let people know I have no idea how to do that formula in Excel. Like somebody has to help me.
Absolutely.
I know it can be done. I just don't know how to do it.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of us that are like, yes. Spreadsheets, I'm out. Alicia, what is your biggest challenge or roadblock right now?
There's this really short-term view of everything. Like, I feel like everything is managed like it's some sort of private equity investment fund, and we're looking at these things like quarter by quarter, or period over period. Like, how does March compare in 2023 to March in 2022? And then this myopic snapshot, and then we make these decisions based on these minuscule data points. And I don't feel like we're like sort of collectively in this global way looking at, like, just dealing with one crisis, running from one fire to the next. We're not building toward anything bigger. Like, I feel like everything is too we're too focused on short-term objectives. We're focused on kind of getting through that next corner. And I see it happening like everywhere. I feel like we don't take the long view. And so everything becomes more transactional, it becomes more short-term. And I don't see how we're going to better the world unless we're thinking about things that are a generation ahead. Like, no one takes a step back and thinks big. So my obstacle and how that affects me is working in this sector that's really important to me, and is like, there's a reason I've dedicated my life to this kind of philanthropic sectors, because I really want to be a part in some way of making the world a better place. I want to leave it better than I found it. But I find it difficult to do because these organizations don't have the runway to think long term. And I don't know how you cure cancer or end homelessness or do any of these really big things without a long-term view.
Do you think COVID like made everybody throw their strategic plans like out the window, and then they just totally forgot to pick them back up again?
The excessive and immediate pivot that everybody had to do, and they kind of were like, everything's upside down, we can't figure it out. So they were like trying to figure it out from 1 minute to the next with really no roadmap. And now we've just stayed.
Yeah, I do feel like we've stayed in survival mode since the pandemic started. And so this survival mode is fatiguing all of us in a multitude of ways. I think you hit the nail on that a little bit.
Literally every person I know is exhausted. Every person I know, their plate is too full. They feel like they're running on low battery mode all the time. And I don't see anything coming that's addressing that. Like, I don't see the pivot of how do we get out of this crazy cycle?
And I think there's a split in society right now between corporate working world, if you will, and wellness. And there's a real disconnect between the two still. I mean, even corporations that are trying to incorporate wellness into their organizational culture, there's a huge disconnect there still. And I think it comes from truly not understanding what real self-care and mental wellness and physical wellness and whole person wellness really is. And so, you have this exhaustion happening because there is massive amounts of information coming at us. We are extended over a multitude of roles in our lives. And, the women in this community talk a lot about imbalance, balance, exhaustion, energy. How do I re-energize? How do I take care of myself? And I was talking to somebody last week and she said, I'm writing in my journal. I'm going to yoga. I have a therapist. I play with my dog. And she's like, Christine, I'm still unhappy and I'm still exhausted. And it's like, well, that might be maintenance self-care, but what is real self-care? And that's, I think, the question we're not asking.
Oh, I think you're so right. There's not a silver bullet. That's the problem. There's not a pill that we can take to make it like, and we're all guilty of being impatient when it comes to like, whatever it is, lose weight, get healthy, do, get worked at. Like, we all want this immediate return on whatever. And it's not how self-care works.
I do this workshop on routines versus rituals and, what takes your energy versus what fills up your cup. And it's a really interesting reflective process because you start realizing that some of the things you thought were self-care or we're, to take care of, you, that's actually not bringing me any joy at all.
Right. Right.
Well, I want to say thank you so much for the time together today. This conversation for me has filled my cup up. I know it's going to help me feel energized the rest of the day. So I just want to thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you for the invitation. This has been lovely. I'm super excited to have been invited, and this is a great chat.
Thanks for joining us today in the Executives Lounge, where we bust open the doors, slam through the ceilings, and make sure that we have a spot at the table and that we are the lounge. I am Christine Fauner, your executive leadership expert, continuously looking for those executive leaders that seek community, continuous learning, and have a desire to find the next adventure. Join us next time. Join our Facebook group, Roam Your Soul, and you can also find us on Instagram at Roam Your Soul. And don't forget to check out the website for upcoming adventures, www.roamyoursoul.com. And if you're looking for that next executive level leadership coach, you can find me at roamyoursoul.com/Christine Fauner Coaching.